There are secrets that live so deep in our hearts they become part of our very bones, buried so far down we think they'll never see daylight again. But sometimes, after decades of silence, those secrets demand to be told. My name is Eleanor Patricia Hayes, but everyone here in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin has called me Grandma Ellie for the past 30 years. I'm 71 years old now, and each line on my weathered hands tells a story of survival, of pain transformed into purpose, of a little girl who found her voice when the world tried to steal it away. I still live in the same farmhouse where I raised my 4 children, just outside the town limits where the cornfields stretch endlessly toward the horizon. It's a peaceful place now, but it wasn't always like that. This house has witnessed tears that could fill Lake Michigan, but it's also seen miracles born from the darkest moments imaginable. Before I share this story that's been locked away for over 50 years, I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to hear. It's about betrayal by those who were supposed to protect me, about silence that nearly destroyed me, and about how a mother's fierce love can move mountains when justice seems impossible. But most importantly, it's about how even the most broken among us can find a way to heal and help others do the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins in the summer of 1963 when I was just 11 years old. We lived in a small farming community called Millfield, about 40 miles south of Cedar Falls. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the rhythm of the week, and where children still played until the shaw. Streetlights came on without a care in the world. Our house was a modest 2-story wooden structure, painted white with green shutters, sitting on 12 acres of farmland that had been in my father's family for 3 generations. The paint was always peeling somewhere, and the floorboards creaked like old bones, but it was home. From my bedroom window upstairs, I could see clear to the Hendersons' farm next door, where their cattle grazed peacefully in fields that seemed to go on forever. My father, Robert Hayes, was a man of few words but strong hands. He worked the land from dawn to dusk, growing corn and soybeans that he'd sell at the market in town every Saturday. Papa was tall and lean, with calloused hands that could fix anything broken and gentle enough to bandage a scraped knee. He had this way of humming old hymns while he worked, melodies that would drift through the kitchen window while Mama prepared our meals. My mother, Catherine Marie Hayes, was the heart of our home. She had auburn hair that caught fire in the afternoon sunlight and eyes the color of spring grass. Mama could stretch $1 further than anyone I've ever known, turning the simplest ingredients into feasts that filled our bellies and warmed our souls. She took in sewing work for the ladies in town, sitting by the window in the evenings with her needle dancing through fabric while she hummed along with Papa's distant songs. I was the middle child, sandwiched between my older brother Samuel, who was 14 and already working the fields alongside Papa, and my little sister Ruth, who was only 8 and still believed in fairy tales and magic. Samuel was serious like Papa, with the same quiet strength and work ethic that ran in the Hayes bloodline. Ruth was all sunshine and giggles, with Mama's red hair and a laugh that could chase away the darkest clouds. We weren't wealthy by any measure, but we were rich in the ways that mattered. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house, when Mama would prepare her famous pot roast with vegetables from our own garden. The smell would fill every corner of the house, drawing us together, around the old oak table that Papa's grandfather had made with his own hands. Those Sundays were when our extended family would gather, turning our quiet farmhouse into a bustling hub of conversation, laughter, and the kind of love that makes you feel invincible. It was during these Sunday gatherings that I first started, noticing something wasn't quite right with Papa's brother, Uncle Frank, and his son, my cousin Danny. Uncle Frank was Papa's younger brother by 6 years, but where Papa was gentle and steady, Uncle Frank had an edge to him that made me uncomfortable, even as a child. He was broader than Papa, with thick arms and a booming voice that seemed to fill whatever room he entered. His laugh was too loud, his jokes often mean-spirited, and he had a way of looking at people that made you feel exposed, vulnerable. Uncle. Frank lived about 20 miles away in a bigger house with fancy furniture and a car that was always newer than anyone else's in the family. He worked as a foreman at the lumber mill and made good money, something he never let anyone forget. When he'd arrive for Sunday dinner, he'd always have some story about his latest purchase or some comment about how simple our farmhouse was compared to his place in town. His son Danny was 15, 3 years older than me, and from the outside, he seemed like the perfect cousin. He was tall for his age, with dark hair slicked back with pomade and clothes that were always pressed and clean. Danny got good grades in school, played on the baseball team, and could charm the birds from the trees when he wanted to. All the girls at school talked about how handsome he was, how lucky I was to have such a cool older cousin. But there were moments, small ones at first, when I'd catch something in Danny's eyes that didn't match his easy smile. The way he'd watch me when he thought no one was looking. How his compliments about how I was growing up so pretty made my skin crawl even though I couldn't explain why. How he'd find excuses to sit next to me at dinner, his leg pressing against mine under the table, in a way that felt wrong, but that I couldn't put into words. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came on a sweltering July afternoon in 1963. It was one of those days when the heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket, making even the chickens seek shade under the porch. Papa and Samuel were in the far fields checking on the corn, and Mama had taken Ruth into town to pick up supplies for canning season. I was alone in the house, something that rarely happened but felt like a special treat at the time. I was in the kitchen, trying to cool off with a glass of lemonade and reading one of Ruth's fairy tale books, when I heard a car pulling up the gravel drive. Through the window, I saw Uncle Frank's shiny blue Buick kicking up dust clouds as it came to a stop near the front porch. My stomach did a little flip, though I couldn't say why. Uncle Frank and Danny climbed out of the car, both dressed in their Sunday best despite the heat. Uncle Frank was carrying a paper bag that looked heavy, and Danny had that smile on his face that I'd learned to distrust, though I couldn't explain why to anyone, least of all myself. "Well, look who's all alone," Uncle Frank said as they walked up the porch steps, his voice carrying that tone that made me want to disappear. "Where's everyone hiding on this beautiful day?" I told them about Papa and Samuel being in the fields and Mama taking Ruth to town. Something flickered across Uncle Frank's face when I said this. Something that made the lemonade turn sour in my mouth. "Perfect timing, then," he said, settling into Papa's chair without being invited. "Danny and I were just driving by and thought we'd stop to visit our favorite girl." Danny perched on the edge of the porch railing, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the way Uncle Frank's breath smelled after he'd been drinking Papa's beer. But it was the middle of the afternoon, and surely they hadn't been drinking. "You're getting so grown up, Ellie," Danny said, his eyes moving over me in a way that made me want to cover myself with my arms, even though I was wearing a perfectly modest dress. "Isn't she, Dad? Our little Ellie's turning into quite the young lady." Uncle Frank's laugh was low and rumbling, like distant thunder before a storm. "She sure is, son. She sure is." They stayed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, making small talk and asking questions about when Papa would be back, when Mama was expected to return. Their questions felt strange, purposeful in a way that set my nerves on edge. When they finally left, promising to stop by again real soon, I felt a relief so profound it was almost dizzying. That night at dinner, when I mentioned Uncle Frank and Danny's visit, Papa looked surprised. "Frank was here? That's odd. He didn't mention anything about visiting when I saw him at church last Sunday." Mama frowned, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Did they say what they wanted?" I shrugged, unable to put my unease into words that would make sense to anyone else. "Just a visit, I guess." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. They had wanted something, but I couldn't figure out what. All I knew was that their visit had left me feeling dirty somehow, like I needed to scrub my skin raw to get clean again. Over the next few weeks, Uncle Frank and Danny started showing up more often, always when Papa was working in the distant fields, always when some member of our family was away. They'd bring gifts sometimes, candy for me and Ruth, a bottle of whiskey for Papa that they'd leave on the kitchen table. Mama was always polite, offering them lemonade or coffee, but I started noticing how her smile never quite reached her eyes when they were around. It was Ruth who first put words to what I was feeling. One evening after Uncle Frank and Danny had left following another unexpected visit, she crawled into my bed as we were supposed to be going to sleep. "Ellie," she whispered, her small hand finding mine under the quilt Mama had made us. "I don't like when Uncle Frank and Danny come to visit." "Why not?" I asked, though my heart was already pounding because I felt the same way. "They look at us funny," she said, her voice so small I had to strain to hear her. "And Danny always tries to touch my hair when Mama's not looking. It makes me feel icky." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they perfectly described the feeling I'd been carrying but couldn't name. That icky feeling that seemed to follow their visits like a bad smell that you can't wash off. "We should tell Mama," Ruth said, but even as she said it, we both knew how impossible that seemed. Tell her what exactly? That Uncle Frank looked at us in a way that made us uncomfortable? That Danny's compliments felt wrong somehow? What kind of evidence was that? As August melted into September and the first hints of autumn began to paint the edges of the maple leaves, Uncle Frank and Danny's visits became more frequent and more purposeful. They'd time their arrivals perfectly, showing up when they knew certain family members would be away. Uncle Frank would always have some excuse. He was in the neighborhood. He wanted to check on us. He'd brought something for Papa. But I was starting to understand that we weren't random stops on their route. We were destinations. The realization came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over the cornfields. They were studying us, learning our routines, figuring out when we were most vulnerable. The gifts, the unexpected visits, the way they'd ask casual questions about Papa's work schedule and Mama's trips to town, it all started to form a pattern that made my blood run cold. I was 11 years old, still young enough to believe that adults always had good intentions, but old enough to recognize when something felt wrong in my very bones. And everything about Uncle Frank and Danny's increasing presence in our lives felt wrong in ways I couldn't yet understand, but that my body seemed to know instinctively. What I didn't know then was that their visits were just the beginning. They were building up to something, preparing for something that would shatter the innocent world of our farmhouse and change the course of my life forever. The man I called Uncle Frank and the boy I'd grown up thinking of as my cousin were about to reveal themselves as something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. But in those final weeks of what I now think of as my childhood, I was still just a little girl who loved fairy tales and believed that monsters only existed in storybooks. I had no idea that the real monsters often come disguised as family, wearing familiar faces and speaking in voices you've known all your life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first time it happened, I was hanging laundry on the line behind our house. It was a crisp October morning in 1963. The kind where your breath makes little puffs of steam and the grass crunches under your feet from the overnight frost. Mama had gone to help Mrs. Peterson down the road, who'd just had her fourth baby and needed assistance with the cooking and cleaning. Papa and Samuel were repairing fence posts in the north pasture, a job that would keep them busy until well after lunchtime. Ruth was at school, having started second grade that fall with all the excitement of a child discovering the magic of reading. I was alone with a basket full of wet sheets and towels, enjoying the peaceful morning and humming one of Mama's favorite hymns. The clothesline stretched between two sturdy oak trees that Papa had planted when he and Mama first bought the farm, and I loved the rhythm of hanging laundry. Shake, pin, move, repeat. It was meditative in a way that my 11-year-old mind couldn't name but deeply appreciated. That's when I heard the distinctive rumble of Uncle Frank's Buick coming up our gravel drive. The engine sound that had become as familiar as it was unwelcome. My hands stilled on the wet pillowcase I was holding, and that now familiar knot formed in my stomach. They hadn't visited in almost 2 weeks, and I'd started to hope that maybe their interest in our family was finally waning. I watched from behind the oak tree as Uncle Frank and Danny got out of the car, both of them scanning the property with those calculating eyes that I'd learned to fear. Uncle Frank was wearing his work clothes this time, heavy denim overalls and steel-toed boots, while Danny was dressed more casually in dungarees and a flannel shirt. They looked like they'd come prepared for something more physical than their usual social visits. "Well, well," Uncle Frank called out when he spotted me behind the clothesline. "If it isn't our pretty little Ellie, all alone again. Seems like we keep catching you at the perfect times." The way he said perfect times made my skin crawl. There was something in his tone that suggested these coincidences weren't coincidental at all, that they'd been watching our house, learning, our routines, waiting for moments exactly like this one. Danny sauntered over with that easy smile that I'd once thought was charming, but now recognized as predatory. "Need some help with that laundry, cousin? Those sheets look pretty heavy for such a little girl." I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell them I could manage just fine on my own, but the words seemed to stick in my throat. These were family members, adults who commanded respect in our household. Papa always spoke well of Uncle Frank, despite my growing unease, and Mama had been raised to be polite to guests no matter what. How could I explain that everything about their presence felt wrong when I couldn't even articulate why? "I'm almost finished," I managed to say, my voice coming out, smaller than I intended. "Mama will be back soon, and Papa's just in the north field if you want to see him." Uncle Frank's laugh was low and rumbling, like stones grinding together. "Oh, we're not here to see your Papa, little darling. We came specifically to see you." The EI pillowcase slipped from my suddenly numb fingers and fell to the frost-covered grass. The way he said, "specifically to see you," sent ice water through my veins. Adults didn't usually come specifically to see children unless something was wrong or unless... "You see, Ellie," Danny said, moving closer so that he was standing between me and the house. "Dad and I have been talking about you a lot lately. About how you're growing up, becoming such a beautiful young lady. We think it's time you learned some things about the world." I backed up until my shoulders hit the rough bark of the oak tree, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. "What kind of things?" Uncle Frank stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the way his eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality that reminded me of how Papa looked after too many beers at harvest time. But it was 10 o'clock. In the morning, far too early for drinking, wasn't it? "Things that nice girls like you need to know," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like oil sliding over my skin. "Things about how to make men happy, how to be useful in ways your mama probably hasn't taught you yet." I didn't understand exactly what he meant, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. The problem was that Danny had positioned himself perfectly to block my path to the house, and Uncle Frank was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating off his body despite the cool morning air. "I should go inside," I whispered, pressing myself harder against the tree bark. "Mama said I should come in if anyone visited while she was away." "But we're not just anyone, are we?" Danny said, his voice taking on a cajoling tone that made my stomach turn. "We're family. Uncle Frank and I would never hurt you, Ellie. We just want to teach you some special games that older girls play." The word games made everything worse, somehow. Games were supposed to be fun, something you wanted to play. But everything about this situation felt dangerous and wrong, like standing too close to a fire that was about to engulf you. Uncle Frank reached out and touched my face with fingers that felt rough and cold against my skin. "Such a pretty little thing," he murmured, "and so innocent. We're going to have to fix that, aren't we, son?" That's when I tried to run. I ducked under Uncle Frank's outstretched arm and bolted toward the house, my feet slipping on the frost-slick grass. But Danny was faster and stronger, catching me around the waist before I'd made it halfway to the back porch. "Now, now," he said, his grip tightening painfully around my middle. "That's not very polite, cousin. We just want to talk to you, maybe show you some things that will make you feel good." I struggled against his hold, but at 15, Danny was already nearly as tall as Papa, and much stronger than my 11-year-old body could match. He carried me back to where Uncle Frank was waiting, setting me down, but keeping his hands on my shoulders to prevent another escape attempt. "Here's what's going to happen, little Ellie," Uncle Frank said, his voice taking on an authoritative tone that brooked no argument. "You're going to come with us for a little ride. We're going to go somewhere quiet where we can have a nice, private conversation about growing up and becoming a woman." "I don't want to go anywhere," I said, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. "Please, I just want to finish the laundry and wait for Mama to come home." Uncle Frank's expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw a flash of real anger cross his features. "What you want doesn't matter much anymore, does it? You're going to learn that pretty girls like you don't always get to choose what happens to them." Danny's grip on my shoulders tightened, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. "Dad's right, Ellie. It's time you learned how the world really works. And if you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut about our little lessons. Because if you don't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but something in his tone made it clear that the consequences would be terrible. They marched me toward the car, Uncle Frank opening the back door while Danny maintained his painful grip on my arms. "Get in," Uncle Frank ordered, and when I hesitated, he added, "Unless you want us to tell your papa that you've been acting inappropriately with boys at school. Unless you want us to explain to him how you've been asking us to teach you adult things." The threat hit me like a physical blow. Papa's disappointment was one of the worst things I could imagine, and the idea that they would lie about me, make him think I had somehow brought this on myself, was more terrifying than whatever they planned to do to me. With trembling legs, I climbed into the back seat of the Buick. Danny slid in beside me while Uncle Frank got behind the wheel, and as we pulled away from the farmhouse, I watched my safe, familiar world disappear through the rear window. They drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, taking back roads through farmland I didn't recognize until we reached an old abandoned barn that sat alone in the middle of a fallow field. The structure looked like it hadn't been used in years, with weathered gray boards and a roof that sagged in places where shingles had blown away. "This is perfect," Uncle Frank said as he parked the car behind the barn where it couldn't be seen from the road. Nice and private, just like I remembered. The implication that he'd been here before, that he'd planned this, made everything so much worse. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a moment of poor judgment. This was premeditated, calculated, prepared for. Inside the barn, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old hay. Weak sunlight filtered through gaps in the boards, creating an eerie pattern of light and shadow across the dirt floor. Uncle Frank had brought a blanket, which he spread out in the far corner, and Danny had a paper bag that clinked when he set it down. "Bourbon," Uncle Frank explained, pulling a bottle from the bag. "To help you relax, little darling. This might be scary at first, but once you get used to it, you'll see how good it can feel." I backed away from them until I hit the barn wall, splinters from the rough boards catching on my dress. "Please," I whispered. "Please just take me home. I won't tell anyone we came here. I promise I won't say anything." But my pleas seemed to have the opposite effect. Uncle Frank's eyes lit up with an excitement that made me feel sick, while Danny moved to block the barn door, eliminating any possibility of escape. "Oh, but you will tell someone eventually," Uncle Frank said, taking a long drink from the bourbon bottle before holding it out to me. "Girls always do. That's why we need to make sure you understand exactly what will happen if you do." What followed was the longest and most terrifying hour of my young life. They took turns explaining in graphic detail what they planned to do to me, what would happen to my family if I ever spoke about it, and how easy it would be for them to hurt Ruth if I didn't cooperate. They forced me to drink from the bourbon bottle until my head spun and my stomach burned, telling me it would make everything easier. But even through the alcohol-induced haze, I understood with crystal clarity that my childhood was ending in that dusty barn, that the innocence I'd carried for 11 years was being stripped away by two people who were supposed to protect me. The fairy tale world where monsters only existed in storybooks was crumbling around me, replaced by a reality where the monsters wore familiar faces and called you by name. When they finally drove me back to the farmhouse, Mama was just returning from helping Mrs. Peterson. I stumbled out of the car on unsteady legs, the taste of bourbon still burning in my throat and my dress torn in places I hoped weren't visible. "There's our sweet Ellie," Uncle Frank called out cheerfully to Mama, as if nothing had happened. We found her finishing up the laundry and offered to take her for a little drive to see the fall colors. "Such a good girl, helping out while you were away." Mama smiled and waved, completely unaware that her middle daughter had just been introduced to a nightmare that would haunt her for decades to come. She didn't notice how I avoided eye contact or how my hands shook as I gathered the laundry that had been left scattered on the ground. "Thank you for looking after her," Mama called back. "You boys are always so thoughtful." As Uncle Frank and Danny drove away, Uncle Frank rolled down his window and looked directly at me. "We'll see you again real soon, Ellie. Real soon." It was a promise and a threat rolled into one, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning. The weeks following that first trip to the abandoned barn transformed me from a carefree 11-year-old into a hollow shell who jumped at every sound and flinched whenever someone touched me unexpectedly. I developed what Mama called nervous habits, biting my nails until they bled, pulling at my hair when I thought no one was looking, and startling awake in the middle of the night with screams that I quickly learned to muffle with my pillow. Sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that dusty barn with Uncle Frank's bourbon-soaked breath on my face and Danny's hands where they didn't belong. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to Ruth's peaceful breathing beside me, wondering how the world could continue spinning normally when mine had been knocked completely off its axis. School became both a refuge and a torture. On one hand, it was 8 hours away from the farm, 8 hours when I knew Uncle Frank and Danny couldn't reach me. But it was also 8 hours of trying to pretend that everything was normal when I felt like I was slowly dying from the inside out. My grades, which had always been solid, began to slip as I found myself unable to concentrate on arithmetic, when my mind was consumed with fear about what would happen the next time they came to visit. Mrs. Henderson, my 6th grade teacher, was the first to notice the change. She was a kind woman in her 50s who wore flowered dresses and always smelled like chalk dust and vanilla perfume. After I'd failed my 3rd spelling test in a row, something that had never happened before, she asked me to stay after class. "Eleanor," she said gently, using my full name like Mama did when she was serious. "I'm concerned about you, dear. You seem distant lately. Is everything all right at home?" I wanted so desperately to tell her. The words were right there, burning in my throat like acid. But Uncle Frank's threats echoed in my head. "If you tell anyone, we'll say you asked for it. We'll tell them you begged us to teach you those things. Who do you think they'll believe? A respectable man like me? Or a little girl who's obviously troubled?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just tired, I guess. Papa's been having me help more with the farm. Work." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. But what could she do? It was 1963, and children's complaints were often dismissed as imagination or attention-seeking. The concept of mandatory reporting didn't exist yet, and even the most well-meaning adults often felt helpless when they suspected something was wrong but had no concrete evidence. "Well," she said finally, "if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to share our burdens." I nodded and mumbled my thanks, but we both knew I wouldn't be taking her up on the offer. The shame that Uncle Frank and Danny had instilled in me was too deep, too all-consuming. They'd convinced me that what was happening was somehow my fault, that I had done something to bring it on myself, and that revelation of the truth would only bring more pain to my family. The second incident happened on a gray November afternoon when the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the bare fields. Mama had taken Ruth to a doctor's appointment in town. Our little sister had been fighting a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Papa was at the grain elevator, selling the last of our corn harvest before winter set in. Samuel was supposed to be home from school by 3 o'clock, but his basketball coach had called an unexpected practice. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of vegetable soup that Mama had left simmering for dinner, when I heard the now familiar sound of Uncle Frank's car crunching up our gravel drive. My spoon clattered into the pot as my hands began to shake, uncontrollably. It had been 3 weeks since the barn incident, 3 weeks during which I'd allowed myself to hope that maybe it had been a one-time occurrence, a terrible mistake that would never be repeated. But as I watched Uncle Frank and Danny climb out of their car with that same predatory confidence, I knew with sinking certainty that my nightmare was just beginning. "Well, hello there, pretty Ellie," Uncle Frank called out as they climbed the porch steps. "All alone again, I see. My, you do seem to have the worst luck with timing." This time, they didn't bother with pretenses or small talk. Uncle Frank pushed past me into the kitchen while Danny closed and locked the front door behind them. A sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. "We've been thinking about you, little darling," Uncle Frank said, his eyes scanning the empty house with satisfaction. "Danny especially has been looking forward to continuing your education." Danny moved to stand behind me, his hands settling on my shoulders with a possessiveness that made my skin crawl. "Dad's right, cousin. We have so much more to teach you, and this time, we don't even need to leave the house." The implication hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to defile my own home, to violate me in the same kitchen where Mama prepared our meals, in the same house where Ruth slept peacefully every night. The violation felt exponentially worse knowing it would happen in my safe space, surrounded by the familiar smells of Mama's cooking and the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking with desperation. "Samuel will be home soon. His practice might end early." Uncle Frank laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Oh, we know exactly when Samuel's practice ends, sweetheart. We've been watching, learning your family's schedule. Young Danny here has been very thorough in his reconnaissance." The word reconnaissance chilled me to the bone. It was a military term, something you'd use to describe scouting enemy territory. The fact that they'd been systematically studying my family's movements, planning these attacks with such calculation and forethought, made everything infinitely more terrifying. Danny's grip on my shoulders tightened as he leaned down to whisper in my ear. "We have almost 2 hours before anyone comes home, cousin. 2 whole hours to play our special games. And this time, you're going to participate more actively." What followed was worse than the barn incident in every conceivable way, not only because of the physical violations, but because they were happening in my own home, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my family's love and protection. The irony was crushing. I was being destroyed in the very place where I should have been safest, while family photographs watched from the walls like silent, helpless witnesses. They were more aggressive this time, more demanding. Uncle Frank produced another bottle of bourbon, but when I tried to refuse it, Danny forced my head back and poured it down my throat until I choked and gasped for air. The alcohol hit my empty stomach like liquid fire, making the room spin and my thoughts become fuzzy and disconnected. "There's a good girl," Uncle Frank murmured as I swayed on my feet. "Much more cooperative when you're relaxed. Now, Danny's going to show you some new things, and you're going to be very grateful for the education." Through the alcohol-induced haze, I was dimly aware of them moving me to the living room, of hands touching me in ways that made me want to disappear entirely. I tried to retreat into my mind, to go somewhere else entirely, but they wouldn't let me. They demanded eye contact, demanded responses, demanded that I remain present for every moment of my own destruction. The worst part was how they framed it as education, as something I should be grateful for. "Most girls your age don't get such experienced teachers," Uncle Frank said, his breathing heavy and labored. "You should thank us for taking such an interest in your development." When it was finally over and they were adjusting their clothes, as if nothing had happened, Uncle Frank sat down in Papa's chair and lit a cigarette, filling our clean kitchen with smoke that would linger for hours. "Now then, little Ellie," he said, his tone conversational as if we'd just finished discussing the weather. "Let's talk about what happens if you ever consider telling anyone about our lessons." Danny perched on the arm of Mama's reading chair, his hair mussed, but his expression coldly calculating. "You see, cousin, people wouldn't understand what we're doing for you. They'd think it was something dirty, something wrong, instead of the valuable education it really is." "If you tell your papa," Uncle Frank continued, blowing smoke toward the ceiling, "I'll have to explain to him how you've been seducing Danny and me, how you've been begging us to teach you grown-up things. Your papa's a traditional man, Ellie. He believes that girls who act inappropriately should be punished severely." The threat was delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. They weren't just threatening to lie about what had happened. They were threatening to destroy my relationship with Papa, to make him believe that his 11-year-old daughter was some kind of deviant who had brought this on herself. "And your sweet little Ruth," Danny added with a smile that made my blood run cold. "Well, she's getting to be such a pretty little thing, too. If you can't keep your mouth shut, we might have to start including her in our lessons. I bet she'd be even more fun to teach than you are." The threat against Ruth was like a knife through my heart. The idea that my baby sister, who still believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, might be subjected to the horrors I was enduring was more than I could bear. In that moment, I would have agreed to anything, endured anything, to keep her safe. "Won't tell," I whispered, my voice hoarse from the bourbon and the screaming I'd held back. "I promise I won't tell anyone." Uncle Frank smiled with satisfaction. "I know you won't, darling. Because you're a smart girl, and you understand what's at stake. Besides, it's not like anyone would believe you anyway. Who would take the word of a troubled little girl over two upstanding members of the community?" They stayed for another hour, making themselves comfortable in our home while I sat in the corner like a broken doll, still dizzy from the alcohol and numb from shock. Uncle Frank raided our icebox, making himself a sandwich with Mama's home-baked bread, while Danny flipped through one of Samuel's baseball magazines as if he hadn't just participated in destroying an 11-year-old child. When they finally left, promising to return very soon, I stumbled to the bathroom and tried to wash away what had happened. But no amount of scrubbing could remove the feeling of their hands on my skin or the taste of bourbon that lingered in my mouth. I changed into a different dress and hid the torn one at the bottom of my dresser drawer, adding it to the growing collection of evidence that I was too ashamed and terrified to reveal. By the time Mama returned with Ruth, I had composed myself enough to help serve dinner and listen to Ruth's chatter about her doctor's visit. But inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was dying a little more each day, consumed by shame and terror and the growing certainty that this was my life now, that Uncle Frank and Danny owned me completely, and there was nothing I could do to escape their web of manipulation and abuse. That night, as I lay beside Ruth listening to her peaceful breathing, I made a decision that would haunt me for decades to come. I decided that silence was my only option, that protecting my family from the truth was more important than protecting myself from the horror. I decided to bury what was happening so deep inside myself that maybe, if I was very lucky, I could pretend it wasn't real at all. What I didn't know then was that silence has its own kind of poison, one that spreads through your soul like cancer, until it consumes everything good and pure inside you. I didn't know that keeping such a terrible secret would nearly destroy me before anyone had a chance to save me. But that knowledge was still months away, hidden in a future I couldn't yet imagine. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing our farm in a layer of snow so thick it seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself. By December of 1963, Uncle Frank and Danny's visits had become a weekly occurrence, sometimes twice a week when the weather was particularly harsh and travel was difficult. The perfect excuse for them to stay longer, to extend their torture. Sessions under the guise of waiting out the storm. They had developed a sophisticated system of surveillance that I was only beginning to understand. Danny had befriended some of the boys from Samuel's school and had learned his entire schedule, every basketball practice, every late study session, every time he'd be working late in the barn with Papa. Uncle Frank had struck up conversations with the ladies at the church social, casually inquiring about Mama's volunteer schedule at the parish kitchen, and her visits to help other families in need. What terrified me most was how normal they seemed to everyone else. Uncle Frank had actually increased his church attendance, sitting in the third pew every Sunday morning with a voice that boomed out hymns louder than anyone else's. Danny had joined the church youth group, charming the pastor's wife with his polite manners and eagerness to help with community service projects. To the outside world, they were model Christian men, pillars of the community who went out of their way to help their extended family. The cognitive dissonance was nearly unbearable. How could the same hands that passed around the collection plate on Sunday morning be the ones that hurt me so terribly during the week? How could the same voice that read Bible verses aloud be the one that whispered such vile threats in my ear? It made me question everything I'd been taught about good and evil, about how the world was supposed to work. My body began to rebel against the constant stress and trauma. I developed chronic stomach problems that left me doubled over in pain, migraines that made it impossible to concentrate in school, and a persistent cough that reminded me uncomfortably of the one Ruth had been fighting. Mama grew increasingly worried about my health, taking me to old Dr. Morrison in town twice before Christmas. Dr. Morrison was a kindly man in his 70s who had delivered half the babies in our county and treated everything from broken bones to broken hearts. He examined me thoroughly, checking my reflexes, listening to my breathing, taking my temperature. But 1963 medical practice didn't include questions about home life or emotional well-being. When he found nothing physically wrong with me, he prescribed a tonic for my stomach and told Mama I was probably just going through a difficult phase that many girls experienced as they approached adolescence. Some children are more sensitive to change than others, he explained to Mama while I sat on the examination table, swinging my legs and trying to look normal. Eleanor's at an age where her body is beginning to prepare for womanhood. These mysterious ailments often resolve themselves with time and patience. If only he had known that my body was indeed being forced to confront womanhood, but not in the natural, healthy way he assumed. If only there had been protocols in place for recognizing the signs of abuse, for asking the right questions, for looking beyond surface symptoms to see the deeper wounds. The holidays that year were a special kind of torture. Christmas Eve fell on a Tuesday, and our extended family traditionally gathered at our farmhouse for Mama's famous Christmas dinner. She'd spend days preparing, baking pies, making stuffing, preparing the goose that Papa would slaughter for the occasion. The house would fill with the warm scents of cinnamon and nutmeg, and normally I would have been right beside her, learning her recipes and absorbing her joy in feeding the people we loved. But this year, every preparation felt like setting the stage for my own execution. I knew Uncle Frank and Danny would be there, sitting at our table, eating our food, accepting our hospitality while planning their next opportunity to destroy me a little more. The anticipation was almost worse than the actual abuse, the way my stomach would clench every time I heard a car in the driveway, the way I'd flinch whenever someone mentioned their names. Christmas morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with icicles hanging from our gutters like frozen tears. Ruth woke up early, bouncing on our shared bed with excitement about the presents under the tree. She was still young enough to believe in magic, still innocent enough to think that Christmas meant nothing but joy and wonder. I envied her more than I could express. "Wake up, Ellie," she whispered, shaking my shoulder. "Santa came. I can see packages under the tree." I forced a smile and let her drag me downstairs, where Papa was already stoking the fire and Mama was preparing the coffee that would fuel her day of cooking. The living room was transformed with Mama's handmade decorations, paper snowflakes in the windows, pine boughs along the mantelpiece, candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. It should have been magical. It should have filled me with the same wonder I'd felt every Christmas of my life. Instead, all I could think about was how Uncle Frank and Danny had violated this same room just weeks before, how they'd turned my sanctuary into a place of horror. The Christmas tree stood in the exact corner where Uncle Frank had cornered me, its twinkling lights a mockery of everything pure and beautiful in the world. Samuel had gotten a new baseball glove from Santa, and Ruth received the baby doll she'd been hoping for. My gift was a set of watercolor paints and a sketchbook. Mama had noticed how I'd been drawing more lately, though she didn't realize it was my only way of expressing emotions I couldn't put into words. The irony wasn't lost on me that art, which should have been about creating beauty, had become my outlet for processing ugliness. The family began arriving around noon. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas came first with their twin boys, followed by Grandma Hayes with her famous apple cider. Each arrival made my anxiety spike higher, because I knew the last car to pull up the drive would contain Uncle Frank and Danny. When they finally arrived, bearing gifts and wearing their Sunday best, the transformation in my family was immediate. Papa's face lit up with genuine pleasure as he embraced his brother, and Mama bustled around making sure they had the warmest seats by the fire. Even Samuel, who was usually reserved around adults, seemed genuinely happy to see Danny, asking about his basketball season and whether he planned to try out for the baseball team in spring. "There's our beautiful Ellie," Uncle Frank boomed as he spotted me hovering in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. "Come give your uncle a Christmas hug, sweetheart." The room fell silent, all eyes on me, waiting for what should have been a natural display of family affection. I could feel Mama's questioning gaze, could sense Papa's slight frown at my hesitation. In that moment, I understood the full genius of their manipulation. They had positioned themselves so perfectly within our family that my refusal to embrace them would raise more questions than my compliance. I walked across the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, letting Uncle Frank wrap his arms around me in what everyone else saw as a loving family hug. But I felt the way his hands lingered on my back, the way he pressed his face into my hair and inhaled deeply. When he finally released me, his eyes held a promise that made my blood turn to ice water. My, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You get prettier every time I see you, little darling. Doesn't she, Danny?" Danny smiled that charming smile that had fooled so many people, including my own family. "She sure does, Dad. Ellie's growing up to be quite the young lady." The compliments should have made me feel good, should have been the kind of praise that any 11-year-old girl would treasure. Instead, they felt like threats wrapped in ribbons, promises of future violations disguised as family affection. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with Mama's best china and the tablecloth that only came out for special occasions. Uncle Frank sat directly across from me, his eyes never leaving my face except to occasionally glance at Ruth, who was chattering excitedly about her new doll. Every time he looked at my little sister, I felt a fresh wave of panic. The threats he'd made about including her in their lessons echoed in my head like a broken record. Danny sat beside me, close enough that our legs touched under the table. Throughout the meal, he'd occasionally brush against me, reaching for the salt, passing the rolls, adjusting his napkin. Each contact felt deliberate, calculated to remind me of his power over me. When Papa proposed a toast to family and the blessings of the season, Danny's hand found my knee under the table, squeezing just hard enough to leave bruises through my Christmas dress. "To family," Uncle Frank agreed, raising his glass with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And to the special bonds that tie us together." The adults all drank to the toast, but I could barely swallow past the lump of terror in my throat. The special bonds he referenced felt like chains, binding me to a fate I couldn't escape no matter how desperately I wanted to. After dinner, while the adults settled in the living room with coffee and Mama's mince pie, the children were expected to play quietly. Ruth immediately went to her new doll, creating elaborate tea parties with the miniature dishes Santa had brought. Samuel disappeared outside to try out his new baseball glove despite the snow, and I found myself cornered in the kitchen, supposedly helping to clear the dishes, with Danny standing guard at the doorway. "Having a nice Christmas, cousin?" Uncle Frank asked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the living room where the adults were discussing farm prices and weather predictions. I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Good," he continued, moving closer, until I was trapped between his body and the kitchen sink. "Because I have a very special present for you, but you'll have to wait until tomorrow to receive it." The implication was clear, and my hands began to shake so violently that I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. Tomorrow was Wednesday, the day Mama always went to town for her weekly shopping. Papa and Samuel would be working on repairs to the barn roof, weather permitting. Ruth would be at her friend Mary's house for a play date that had been planned for weeks. I would be alone. Completely, utterly alone. "I can see you understand," Uncle Frank murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "Smart girl. And remember, if you try to change any of those plans, if you suddenly develop another mysterious illness, or find an excuse to tag along with your mama, there will be consequences. Very serious consequences for your whole family." Danny appeared beside us, ostensibly helping to carry dishes but really adding his own layer of menace to the threat. "Dad's right, Ellie. We've been looking forward to giving you your special present for weeks now. It would be very disappointing if something prevented us from celebrating with you properly." The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I sat through games of charades, pretended to enjoy Grandma Hayes' stories about Christmases from her childhood, and even managed to smile when Ruth insisted I help her name her new doll. But underneath the surface, I was drowning in despair, counting down the hours until tomorrow's inevitable horror. When the extended family finally left that evening, Uncle Frank made a point of hugging me extra tightly, whispering in my ear so quietly that only I could hear. "Sweet dreams, little darling. Tomorrow's going to be a very special day." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Ruth slept peacefully beside me, her new doll clutched in her arms. Outside, the wind howled around our farmhouse, rattling the windows and reminding me how isolated we were, how far from help. I thought about running away, about confessing everything to Mama, about throwing myself on Papa's mercy and begging for protection. But every scenario I imagined ended the same way, with my family destroyed, with Ruth in danger, with blame and shame falling on me for bringing this horror into our home. Uncle Frank and Danny had crafted their web of manipulations so carefully that escape seemed impossible. They had made themselves indispensable to our family while making me complicit in my own destruction. As the clock on Mama's nightstand ticked, toward midnight, marking the end of Christmas and the beginning of what I was certain would be the worst day of my life, I made a decision that would haunt me for decades. I decided to endure whatever they had planned, to survive it somehow, and to protect my family's innocence for as long as possible. What I didn't know was that tomorrow would bring not just more horror, but also the first crack in the wall of silence that had protected Uncle Frank and Danny for so long. Tomorrow would be the day that their carefully constructed facade would finally begin to crumble, though not in any way I could have predicted. The morning of December 26th dawned gray and bitter, with a wind that seemed to cut straight through the walls of our farmhouse. I woke before sunrise, my stomach churning with the familiar cocktail of dread and nausea that had become my constant companion. Ruth was still sleeping peacefully beside me, her new Christmas doll tucked under her chin, completely unaware that her big sister was living in a waking nightmare. I dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, choosing my oldest, most shapeless dress, as if somehow making myself less appealing might protect me from what was coming. My hands shook as I brushed my hair, and I caught sight of myself in Mama's small mirror. The girl looking back at me was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with the kind of haunted expression that should never appear on an 11-year-old's face. Downstairs, Mama was already bustling around the kitchen, preparing for her weekly trip to town. She hummed softly as she made her shopping list, completely unaware that she was orchestrating the perfect conditions for my continued destruction. Papa was at the kitchen table, drinking his morning coffee and discussing plans for repairing the barn roof with Samuel, who was wolfing down Mama's pancakes with the appetite of a growing 14-year-old boy. "Ellie, sweetheart," Mama said, when she noticed me hovering in the doorway. "You look pale this morning. Are you feeling all right?" For a moment, I considered telling her I was sick, begging to come to town with her, anything to avoid being alone when Uncle Frank and Danny arrived. But Uncle Frank's threats echoed in my mind, the promises of what would happen to Ruth, to my whole family, if I disrupted their plans. "I'm fine, Mama," I lied, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Just tired from yesterday." She studied my face with the kind of maternal intuition that I both craved and feared. "Well, you can rest while I'm in town. Mrs. Patterson asked me to pick up some special thread for her, so I might be gone longer than usual. Will you be all right here by yourself?" The irony was crushing. Mama was asking if I'd be all right alone, not knowing that being alone was exactly what would make me decidedly not all right. But I nodded and managed what I hoped passed for a reassuring smile. "Ruth's going to Mary's house, and Papa and Samuel will be working on the barn," I said, reciting the schedule that Uncle Frank had somehow learned in advance. "I'll probably just read and maybe work on some drawings." Papa looked up from his coffee, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that made my heart ache. "You sure you're feeling well, little bird? You've been quiet lately." "Not quite. Yourself." The nickname he'd called me since I was tiny, Little Bird, nearly broke my resolve entirely. I wanted so desperately to fly into his arms and tell him everything, to let him protect me the way fathers were supposed to protect their daughters. But Uncle Frank's words haunted me. "Your papa's a traditional man, Ellie. He believes girls who act inappropriately should be punished severely." "I'm just growing up, I guess," I said, using Dr. Morrison's explanation as a shield. "That's what the doctor said anyway." Papa nodded slowly, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of suspicion, a father's instinct that something wasn't right with his middle child. If only I had been brave enough to trust that instinct, to believe that his love for me was stronger than whatever lies Uncle Frank might tell. By 9 o'clock, the house had emptied out according to the schedule that Uncle Frank knew by heart. Mama had driven off to town in our old pickup truck, her shopping list and Mrs. Patterson's thread money tucked safely in her purse. Papa and Samuel had headed out to the barn with their tools and lumber, planning to work until the light failed. Ruth had skipped off to the Patterson farm next door, her new doll in tow, and promises to be home by supper time. I was alone in the house that had once been my sanctuary, waiting for the monsters to arrive. They came at exactly 10 o'clock, as punctual as death itself. I heard Uncle Frank's Buick long before I saw it, the engine sound that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. Through the kitchen window, I watched them park behind the house where the car wouldn't be visible from the road, a precaution that spoke to just how calculated and premeditated their actions had become. But something was different this time. As they climbed out of the car, I noticed Uncle Frank was carrying what looked like a camera, one of those expensive models that only professional photographers used. Danny had a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, and both of them moved, with a sense of purpose that was even more terrifying than their usual predatory confidence. "Merry Christmas, little darling," Uncle Frank called out as they climbed the back porch steps. "Ready for your special present?" I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, my body refusing to obey my mind's frantic commands to run, to hide, to do something other than stand there like a lamb waiting for slaughter. Uncle Frank pushed past me into the house with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, while Danny closed and locked the door behind them with that same chilling finality I'd learned to dread. My, Uncle Frank said, looking around the empty house with satisfaction. Perfect timing, as always. We have the whole place to ourselves for hours. Danny set his satchel down on Mama's kitchen table and began unpacking its contents. More rope than they'd ever used before, a bottle of bourbon that was larger than usual, and several items I didn't recognize but that made my stomach lurch, with fresh terror. "Today's going to be very special, Ellie," Danny said, his voice taking on that false, gentle tone that was somehow more frightening than outright threats. "We're going to create some memories that will last forever." Uncle Frank held up the camera, and the full horror of their plan began to dawn on me. They weren't just planning to abuse me again. They were planning to document it, to create permanent evidence of my destruction that they could use to ensure my silence forever. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please don't do this. I promise I'll never tell anyone anything. I promise I'll do whatever you want, but please don't take pictures." Uncle Frank's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Oh, but sweetheart, that's exactly why we need the pictures. See, we've realized that threats only go so far. But photographs? Well, photographs are forever. Imagine how your papa would react if he saw pictures of his little girl participating so enthusiastically in adult activities." The word participating hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to make it look like I was a willing participant, to create evidence that would destroy not just my reputation, but my family's faith in me. The sophistication of their cruelty was breathtaking. "And if anything ever happens to us," Danny added with that smile that no longer fooled me, "well, we've made arrangements for those photographs to find their way to certain people. Your pastor, maybe, or the sheriff. Can you imagine the scandal?" I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to fight back with every ounce of strength in my small body. But I was 11 years old, alone, and facing two grown men who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. The mathematical impossibility of escape was crushing. What happened next was the worst violation yet, made exponentially more traumatic by the presence of that camera. Uncle Frank directed the scene like some kind of perverted movie director, positioning me in ways that would make it appear consensual, coaching me to smile for the camera even as tears streamed down my face. Danny followed his father's instructions, with an enthusiasm that revealed just how much he enjoyed my suffering. But in their arrogance, in their absolute certainty that they had created the perfect crime, they made a mistake. A mistake so small that they didn't even notice it, but one that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The camera required a flash for indoor photography, and Uncle Frank was not as skilled with the equipment as he thought he was. In his eagerness to document my humiliation, he accidentally double-exposed several shots, creating images that were blurred and overlapping. Frustrated by the technical difficulties, he began snapping pictures more rapidly than necessary, burning through the expensive film in his haste to capture every angle of my degradation. What neither of them realized was that Papa had not gone to work on the barn roof as planned. The wind that morning had been too strong, making it dangerous to work at height. Instead, he and Samuel had decided to repair some equipment in the workshop that was located just behind our house, close enough that the repeated flashing of the camera was visible through the workshop windows. Papa noticed the flashes first, thinking perhaps there was an electrical problem in the house. He sent Samuel to continue working and walked toward the house to investigate, his heavy work boots crunching through the snow that had fallen overnight. Meanwhile, inside the house, Uncle Frank and Danny were so absorbed in their sick photography session that they failed to notice Papa's approach. The bourbon they'd forced me to drink had made me dizzy and compliant, exactly as they'd planned, but it also meant I was barely aware of anything beyond my immediate suffering. Papa reached the back door just as Uncle Frank was preparing to take another photograph. Through the window, he could see strange flashing lights and shadows moving in ways that didn't make sense. His father's instincts, already heightened by weeks of noticing that something was wrong with his middle daughter, kicked into overdrive. Instead of knocking or calling out as he normally would, Papa quietly tried the door handle. Finding it locked, unusual for a farmhouse in the middle of the day, he used his spare key to enter silently through the mudroom that connected to the kitchen. Scene that greeted him was one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His 11-year-old daughter, his little bird, in a state of undress and obvious distress, while his own brother and nephew violated her in ways that his mind initially refused to process. The camera in Uncle Frank's hands, the deliberate staging, the calculated cruelty of it all. It hit Papa like a physical blow that knocked the wind from his lungs. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved. Papa stood in the doorway, his face cycling through disbelief, comprehension, and finally, a rage so pure and righteous that it seemed to fill the entire room. Uncle Frank and Danny, caught in the act of their most heinous crime, froze like deer in headlights. Then Papa exploded into action with a violence I had never seen from my gentle, hymn-humming father. His work-hardened fists connected with Uncle Frank's face with a sound like an axe hitting wood, sending the camera flying across the room to shatter against the kitchen wall. Danny tried to run, but Papa caught him by the collar and threw him against the kitchen table with enough force to crack the solid oak surface that had been in our family for generations. "Samuel!" Papa roared, his voice carrying across the farmyard with an authority that brooked no argument. "Get in here now! And bring the rope from the barn!" What followed was swift and brutal. Papa, normally the gentlest of men, became an avenging angel protecting his child. Uncle Frank, for all his bluster and intimidation, proved to be a coward when faced with righteous fury. Danny, who had seemed so confident and controlling when terrorizing an 11-year-old girl, dissolved into pleading tears when confronted by a man's justice. Within minutes, both of them were bound with the same rope they had brought to restrain me, their faces bloody and their eyes wide with terror. Papa wrapped me in Mama's quilt and held me close while Samuel, who had arrived just in time to witness the end of the violence, stood guard over our captives with Papa's shotgun. "Ellie," Papa said, his voice gentle again, despite the fury still, blazing in his eyes. "How long, little bird? How long has this been happening?" Through my tears and trauma, I managed to tell him about the barn, about the visits, about the threats against Ruth that had kept me silent. With each revelation, Papa's face grew harder, his jaw tighter, his resolve more absolute. "They're never going to hurt you again," he promised, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Never again, little bird. Papa's here now." But even as relief flooded through me for the first time in months, I knew that this was only the beginning. The hardest parts, the questions, the shame, the long road to healing, were still ahead. Uncle Frank and Danny's reign of terror was over, but the damage they had done would take much longer to repair. The little girl who had been destroyed, piece by piece, was gone forever. But in her place, protected by her father's love and her family's fierce determination to see justice done, a survivor was being born. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal after months of helpless silence. Papa sent Samuel to fetch Sheriff Morrison from town, while he stood guard over Uncle Frank and Danny with a determination that was both comforting and terrifying. I had never seen my gentle father look so dangerous, his jaw set like granite, and his eyes burning with a cold fury that seemed to radiate from his very core. Mama returned from town just as Sheriff Morrison's patrol car was pulling into our driveway, and the sight that greeted her nearly brought her to her knees. Her middle daughter wrapped in a quilt, her husband standing over two bound and bloodied men, and the unmistakable evidence of violence scattered across her once peaceful kitchen. The broken camera lay in pieces near the stove, its film exposed and ruined, while overturned chairs and the cracked kitchen table told the story of Papa's righteous intervention. "Robert, what in God's name?" Mama began, but Papa cut her off with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. "Catherine, take Ellie upstairs," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of barely controlled rage. "Help her get cleaned up and dressed properly. The sheriff's going to need to talk to her, and she needs to be ready." Mama's eyes moved from Papa to me to the two men on the floor, and I watched as understanding dawned across her features, like a sunrise revealing devastation after a storm. Her face went through the same progression Papa's had: disbelief, comprehension, and finally, a mother's protective fury that was every bit as fierce as her husband's. "How long?" she whispered, kneeling beside me and cupping my face in her work-worn hands. "Oh, my sweet girl, how long has this been happening?" The question broke something loose inside me, and I found myself sobbing out the whole terrible story. The barn, the visits, the threats against Ruth, the photographs they'd planned to use to ensure my permanent silence. With each revelation, Mama's face grew harder, her grip on my hands tighter, her breathing more shallow and controlled. Sheriff Morrison was a different breed of lawman than you might find today. He was a tall, angular man in his 50s who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little, but even he seemed shaken by what he found in our kitchen. While Papa gave his account of the discovery and subsequent capture, the sheriff examined the broken camera and scattered film with the methodical attention of someone who understood the gravity of what had almost been created. "Frank Hayes," he said, shaking his head as he looked down at Uncle Frank's bloodied form. "I've known you since we were boys, and I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes." Uncle Frank, who had been so confident and controlling just hours before, now looked like exactly what he was, a broken, pathetic man whose crimes had finally caught up with him. His lip was split from Papa's fist, and one eye was swollen shut, but it was the shame and fear in his remaining good eye that revealed the true extent of his fall from grace. "It's not what it looks like," he mumbled through his damaged mouth, still trying to maintain the fiction even with the evidence scattered around him. "The girl, she asked us to—" Papa moved so fast that Sheriff Morrison had to physically restrain him from delivering another beating. "You lying piece of filth," Papa snarled, straining against the sheriff's grip. "She's 11 years old, Frank. 11 years old, and you and your boy have been—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice breaking with emotion and rage. Sheriff Morrison kept his firm grip on Papa's arm while addressing Uncle Frank with the kind of cold professionalism that carried more menace than any physical threat. "Frank Hayes, you and your son are under arrest for multiple counts of child abuse, sexual assault, and conspiracy to produce indecent images of a minor. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right before you say something that makes this even worse for you." Danny, who had been silent since Papa's initial assault, finally spoke up with a voice that cracked like a 12-year-old boy's. "Dad, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to Mama?" The question revealed something I hadn't considered in all my months of terror. These monsters had families too. Danny's mother, Aunt Louise, was a quiet woman who baked excellent cookies and never missed church. How would she survive the scandal? How would the community react when the truth came out? Sheriff Morrison's expression softened slightly when he looked at Danny, perhaps seeing a 15-year-old boy rather than a predator for just a moment. Son, what happens to you depends on a lot of factors. Your age, your cooperation with the investigation, whether you show genuine remorse for what you've done. But I'll tell you this. Your life, as you knew it, is over. The question now is whether you're going to make things better or worse for yourself going forward. The sheriff spent the next 2 hours taking detailed statements from Papa, Mama, Samuel, and finally from me. I had never been questioned by a police officer before, and despite his gentle manner, the process was exhausting and traumatic. He asked about dates, times, specific details that I had tried so hard to forget. But with Papa sitting beside me and Mama holding my hand, I found the strength to tell the truth in all its ugly detail. "You're very brave, Miss Eleanor, Sheriff," Morrison told me when we were finished. "I know this was hard, but your courage is going to help make sure these men can never hurt another child." As Uncle Frank and Danny were loaded into the patrol car, their hands cuffed behind their backs and their heads hanging in shame, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The absence of fear. For the first time since that initial Sunday, dinner when this nightmare began, I could look at them without terror, without the crushing weight of their threats and manipulation. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by their capture and exposure. Uncle Frank, who had seemed so large and powerful when he was terrorizing an 11-year-old girl, now appeared to be exactly what he was. A middle-aged man who had used his position of trust to harm a child. Danny, who had intimidated me with his size and age, was revealed as nothing more than a scared teenager who had followed his father's lead into depravity. The news of their arrest spread through our small farming community like wildfire. By evening, our driveway was filled with cars as neighbors and church members came to offer support and express their shock and disgust. Pastor Williams arrived with his wife, both of them red-eyed and shaken by the revelation that 2 of their most visible congregants had been living such double lives. "I should have seen something," Pastor Williams kept repeating, his voice thick with guilt and regret. "There should have been signs, something that would have warned us." Mama, who had always been diplomatic in her dealings with church politics, spoke with a directness that surprised everyone, including Papa. "The only people responsible for this are the ones who did it, Pastor. Evil is good at hiding itself, especially when it wraps itself in righteousness." Dr. Morrison came to the house that evening, not in his professional capacity, but as a friend of the family who had heard the news and wanted to offer his support. This time, his examination was thorough and documented, creating the medical evidence that would be crucial in the upcoming legal proceedings. "I'm sorry I missed this before," he told Mama and Papa privately. "The signs were there. The weight loss, the anxiety, the unexplained illnesses. In my day, we weren't trained to look for these things. But that's no excuse." The old doctor's regret was genuine, but Mama was characteristically gracious in her response. "You treated the symptoms you could see, Dr. Morrison. None of us knew to look deeper." As the evening wore on and the last of the visitors departed, our family found ourselves alone together for the first time since the morning's revelation. Ruth had been kept at the Pattersons' house during the worst of the chaos, but she was home now, confused by the day's events but safe in the knowledge that her big sister was no longer in danger. Papa built up the fire in the living room, and we all gathered around it, Mama in her rocking chair, Papa in his reading chair, Samuel on the floor with his back against the couch, Ruth curled up with her doll, and me wrapped in Mama's heaviest quilt, finally feeling warm for the first time. "In months, are they going to prison, Papa?" Samuel asked, his 14-year-old voice trying to sound adult but betraying his youth and confusion. Papa's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm and measured. "That's up to the courts, son. But they'll never hurt Ellie again, or any other. Child, if I have anything to say about it." Ruth, who had been quiet since learning that something bad had happened to me, crawled over and settled against my side. "I'm sorry they hurt you, Ellie," she whispered, her small arms wrapping around me with fierce protectiveness. "I love you." Those simple words from my 8-year-old sister broke through the last of my emotional defenses, and I cried then. Not the silent, fearful tears I had shed in the darkness of our shared room, but healing tears that came with the knowledge that I was loved, protected, and believed. Mama came to sit on my other side, stroking my hair the way she had when I was small and had nightmares about imaginary monsters. "It's over now, sweetheart," she murmured. "The real monsters are gone, and they can't hurt you anymore." But even as I felt the safety and love surrounding me, I knew that the healing process would be long and difficult. The physical abuse had ended, but the psychological scars would take much longer to fade. Trust would have to be rebuilt, not just in other people but in myself and my own judgment. The innocent child I had been was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood far too early that the world could be a dangerous place even within the supposed safety of family. The legal proceedings that followed would dominate our lives for months. There would be trials, testimony, media attention that our quiet farming community had never experienced. Uncle Frank and Danny would eventually be sentenced to significant prison terms, their reputations destroyed and their family left to pick up the pieces of the devastation they had caused. But that night, as I sat surrounded by the love and protection of my real family, I felt something that had been absent for so long I had almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Hope that I could heal. Hope that I could trust again. Hope that the nightmares would eventually fade and be replaced by dreams. The little girl who had been broken by months of systematic abuse was beginning to understand that being broken didn't mean being destroyed. With time, love, and the fierce protection of those who truly cared about her, she could be healed. She could survive. She could even, eventually, learn to thrive. The road ahead would be long and sometimes difficult, but, for the first time in months, I could see a path forward that didn't end in darkness, and that made all the difference in the world. The trial began 6 months later, in the spring of 1964, when the apple trees were blooming and the world seemed full of new possibilities. But inside the Cedar Falls County Courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of ugly truths that no one wanted to confront. I was 12 now, having celebrated a birthday that felt more like a milestone of survival than a joyful occasion, and the months between the arrests and the trial had been a mixture of healing and preparation for the ordeal to come. Those 6 months had not been easy. Our small farming community, which had always prided itself on knowing everyone's business, suddenly found itself divided between those who supported our family and those who whispered that perhaps we were making more of the situation than it warranted. Some of the older folks, particularly those who had known Uncle Frank since childhood, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had revealed himself to be. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, became one of our fiercest allies. She had been caring for Ruth the day everything came to light, and she blamed herself for not recognizing the signs earlier. "I should have known something was wrong," she told Mama over coffee one afternoon. "A woman who's raised 6 children should have seen that you were suffering, Eleanor." But it was Dr. Morrison who provided the most unexpected support. The elderly physician had been profoundly affected by his failure to recognize my abuse during those earlier examinations, and he had spent the months since educating himself about trauma in children. He arranged for me to see a specialist in Madison, a psychiatrist named Dr. Helena Kushner, who was pioneering new approaches to treating childhood trauma. Dr. Kushner was unlike anyone I had ever met. She was a small, energetic woman in her 40s who had fled Nazi Germany as a child and brought with her an understanding of how evil could hide behind ordinary faces. Her office was filled with children's drawings and toys, and she had a way of making even the most difficult conversations feel safe and manageable. "What happened to you was not your fault," she told me during our first session, a message she would repeat countless times over the months that followed. Adults who hurt children are very good at making children believe they are responsible, but that is a lie designed to keep the child silent. You were a victim, Eleanor, not a participant. These sessions were difficult, but necessary. Dr. Kushner helped me understand that the shame I carried belonged to Uncle Frank and Danny, not to me. She taught me breathing exercises for when the nightmares came, and she helped me find ways to express the feelings I couldn't put into words. Most importantly, she prepared me for the trial, explaining what would happen and helping me understand that telling my story in court was an act of courage, not betrayal. The legal proceedings themselves were unlike anything our small town had ever experienced. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Margaret Chin who had been specially assigned from the state capitol, had built what she called an airtight case against Uncle Frank and Danny. The physical evidence, the witness testimony from Papa and Samuel, and my own detailed statements had created a web of proof that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't unravel. Danny's lawyer tried to paint him as a victim himself, corrupted by his father's influence and deserving of mercy due to his youth. There was some truth to this argument. Danny had been only 15 when the abuse began, and it was clear that Uncle Frank had been the primary instigator. But the prosecution effectively argued that Danny's age didn't excuse his actions, particularly given the calculated nature of their crimes and the psychological warfare they had waged against me. Uncle Frank's defense team took a different approach, attempting to discredit my testimony by suggesting I was an emotionally disturbed child who had fabricated the allegations. They brought in their own psychological expert who testified that children my age were prone to fantasy and attention-seeking behavior. It was devastating to sit in that courtroom and listen to a man in a suit describe me as a liar and manipulator, particularly when I could see some members of the jury nodding along with his testimony. But Prosecutor Chen was ready for this strategy. She had arranged for Dr. Kushner to testify about childhood trauma and the behavioral patterns she had observed in genuine victims versus those who fabricated allegations. More importantly, she had the broken camera and the remnants of the film that Uncle Frank had been taking when Papa discovered them. Even though the images themselves were too damaged to develop clearly, the mere existence of the photographic equipment told a story that no amount of psychological theorizing could explain away. My own testimony was the most difficult day of my young life. Despite months of preparation with Dr. Kushner and the victim's advocate assigned to our case, walking into that courtroom and seeing Uncle Frank and Danny sitting at the defense table felt like stepping back into my worst nightmare. They were dressed in suits and ties, looking respectable and almost sympathetic, which somehow made everything worse. The prosecutor guided me through my story with gentle professionalism, allowing me to tell what had happened in my own words, without making me relive every traumatic detail. But the defense attorneys were less kind. Uncle Frank's lawyer, a man named Johnson who seemed to view me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a child seeking justice, pressed me on details and timelines, trying to find inconsistencies in my memory that he could exploit. "Now, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "you've admitted that you sometimes had trouble sleeping and experienced what you called nightmares, even before these alleged incidents began. Isn't it possible that you've confused dreams with reality? That your imagination has gotten the better of you?" I remember looking out at the gallery where my family sat, seeing Papa's clenched fists and Mama's tear-streaked face, and finding the strength to answer clearly and firmly. "No, sir. I know the difference between nightmares and real life. I wish what happened to me had been just a bad dream, but it wasn't." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with a parade of witnesses testifying to character, evidence, and expert opinions. Pastor Williams took the stand to express his shock and betrayal at Uncle Frank's actions, while Aunt Louise, Danny's mother, tearfully testified about the changes she had noticed in her son's behavior, but had been too afraid to question. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell who had grown up in our community but moved away for college. She had read about the trial in the newspapers and contacted the prosecutor's office with her own story about Uncle Frank. It turned out that 15 years earlier, when she was just 10 years old, Uncle Frank had molested her during a family gathering, but she had been too frightened to tell anyone at the time. "I thought I was the only one," she said, her voice shaking as she testified. "I've carried that secret for 15 years, thinking it was my fault, thinking no one would believe me. When I read about Eleanor's courage in speaking out, I knew I had to come forward too." Her testimony was devastating to the defense's case. It established a pattern of behavior that predated Uncle Frank's abuse of me by over a decade, and it showed that his crimes were not impulsive acts, but part of a long-standing pattern of predatory behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts for both Uncle Frank and Danny. Uncle Frank was sentenced to 15 years in state prison, while Danny, due to his age at the time the crimes began, received 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5. As the sentences were read, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they would be locked away and unable to hurt other children. Satisfaction that justice had been served. But also sadness for the family members who were innocent victims of their crimes. Aunt Louise, who had lost both her husband and son in one terrible revelation, and Danny's younger sister, who would grow up with the shame of her family's notoriety. The months that followed the trial were a time of gradual healing and adjustment. Our family had been forever changed by what we had endured, but we had also been strengthened by surviving it together. Papa, who had always been gentle and soft-spoken, had discovered a protective fierce that surprised everyone, including himself. Mama had evolved from a woman who avoided conflict into an advocate who wouldn't hesitate to speak up when she saw injustice. Samuel, who had witnessed more of the aftermath than any teenager should have to see, channeled his anger and confusion into athletics, becoming one of the best baseball players in our county's history. Ruth, still young enough to be somewhat shielded from the worst details, grew up with an understanding that families protect each other and that secrets that hurt should never be kept. For me, the healing process was slower and more complicated. Dr. Kushner continued to see me weekly for over a year, helping me work through the trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. She taught me that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it didn't matter, but about learning to carry the experience without letting it define my entire life. "You are not just a victim, Eleanor," she told me during one of our last sessions. "You are a survivor, and survivors have a choice about what they do with their experiences. You can let this destroy you, or you can use it to become stronger and help others who face similar challenges." Those words would prove prophetic, though I couldn't know it at the time. The 12-year-old girl who walked out of that courthouse, after Uncle Frank and Danny's sentencing, had no idea that she would spend much of her adult life working to protect other children from the horrors she had endured. School became easier as I grew older, and the immediate trauma began to fade. My teachers, who had been informed about the situation in general terms, were patient with my struggles and supportive of my recovery. Mrs. Henderson, my 6th-grade teacher who had first noticed something was wrong, became a mentor who encouraged my love of reading and writing. "You have a gift for expressing yourself, Eleanor," she told me when I submitted a story for the school literary magazine. "Don't ever lose that voice. The world needs people who can tell difficult truths with courage and compassion." By the time I entered high school, I had developed a reputation as someone who could be trusted with secrets and who would stand up for classmates who were being bullied or mistreated. It wasn't a conscious decision to become an advocate. It was simply who I had become through surviving my own ordeal and learning that silence in the face of abuse only allows it to continue. The town eventually moved on from the scandal, as small towns always do when faced with uncomfortable truths. Uncle Frank and Danny became cautionary tales, their names spoken in whispers when parents wanted to warn their children about trusting too easily. Their house was sold to pay legal fees, and Aunt Louise moved away to start over somewhere new. But our family carried the experience with us in ways both painful and profound. We had learned that evil could wear familiar faces and speak in trusted voices, but we had also learned that love and courage could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. We had discovered that justice, while sometimes slow and imperfect, was possible when victims found the strength to speak and communities found the wisdom to listen. Most importantly, we had learned that families could survive almost anything if they refused to let shame and secrecy poison their bonds. The Hayes family that emerged from the trial was different from the one that had existed before Uncle Frank and Danny's crimes, but we were also stronger, more honest, and more determined to protect each other from whatever challenges the future might bring. 23 years had passed since the trial when I received the phone call that would change the trajectory of my life once again. It was a crisp October morning in 1987, and I was in my kitchen preparing breakfast for my own family, my husband Marcus, whom I had met at the University of Wisconsin, and our 3 children, Michael, 16, Sarah, 14, and little Thomas, just 8 years old. I had built what most people would consider a normal, successful life. After graduating high school with honors, I had earned a degree in social work, driven by a calling I couldn't quite articulate but knew was connected to my childhood experiences. Marcus and I had married when I was 22, and he had been patient and understanding as I shared my story with him piece by piece, never rushing me, but always supporting my journey toward complete healing. We had settled in Cedar Falls, not far from the farmhouse where I had grown up, though Papa and Mama had both passed away in the early 1980s. The farm had been sold to a young family who appreciated its history and continued to work the land with the same care and respect that Papa had shown. Sometimes I would drive by and feel a complex mixture of pain and peace, remembering both the worst and best moments of my childhood in that place. The phone call that October morning came from Detective Linda Rodriguez of the Madison Police Department. She had tracked me down through court records, she explained, because they were investigating a new case that had connections to my past. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, using my married name, "I'm calling about Frank Hayes. I understand you were the victim in a case against him back in 1964. My hands began to shake at the mention of Uncle Frank's name, a Pavlovian response that I thought I had conquered years earlier. "Yes," I managed to say. What about him?" "He was released from prison 3 years ago after serving 12 years of his sentence. He moved to Madison and got a job at a community center that serves disadvantaged youth. Mrs. Thompson, we have reason to believe he's been abusing children again." The coffee mug I had been holding slipped from my fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, the sound causing Marcus to look up from his newspaper with concern. Our children, getting ready for school, noticed the tension immediately. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We think at least 4, maybe more, boys this time, between the ages of 10 and 13. The pattern is very similar to what you described in your testimony: grooming, isolation, threats to keep them silent. One of the boys finally found the courage to tell his mother, and that's how we found out." I closed my eyes and felt the familiar surge of rage and helplessness that always accompanied news of child abuse. But this time, there was something else, a burning determination that surprised me with its intensity. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Detective Rodriguez explained that the prosecution wanted to use my case as evidence of Uncle Frank's previous pattern of behavior. More importantly, she asked if I would be willing to testify again, to help these new victims understand that they could survive what had happened to them and that their voices mattered. "I'll do whatever you need," I told her without hesitation. "Those children deserve justice, and Uncle Frank needs to be stopped permanently this time." The conversation with my family that evening was one of the most difficult I had ever had. Marcus knew my history, of course, but our children had only been told general details about why their mother did volunteer work with abused children and why she sometimes woke up from nightmares. Now, faced with the possibility of another trial and media attention, We had to decide how much truth they were old enough to handle. Michael, our eldest, listened with the serious expression he had inherited from his father. "Mom," he said when I finished explaining the situation, "if you need to do this to help those kids, then we'll support you. But are you sure you're ready to go through all that again?" It was a remarkably mature question from a 16-year-old, and it made me realize how much my own experiences had shaped the way I raised my children. They had grown up understanding that families protect each other, that secrets should never be kept when someone is being hurt, and that speaking the truth, even when it's difficult, is always the right choice. Sarah, always the most empathetic of our children, came to sit beside me on the couch. "Will you have to see him again? The man who hurt you?" I nodded, and she wrapped her arms around me with a fierceness that reminded me of my sister Ruth. "Then we'll all be there with you," she said. "You won't have to face him alone this time." Little Thomas, who didn't fully understand what was happening but could sense the gravity of the situation, climbed onto my lap and declared, "I'll protect you, Mama. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Their support meant everything to me, but I also knew that the decision to testify again would affect all of them. Our family would be thrust into the spotlight, our private pain made public once more, and our children would have to deal with the whispers and stares that inevitably accompanied such cases. The second trial began in the spring of 1988, and it was both similar to and completely different from my experience in 1964. The legal system had evolved significantly in the intervening years, with better protections for victims and a greater understanding of the psychological dynamics of child abuse. Victim advocates worked with each of the families, and the prosecution had access to psychological research that hadn't existed during my childhood case. But Uncle Frank himself was a different creature entirely. Prison had aged him harshly. His hair was completely gray now, his face lined and hardened by years of incarceration. Most chilling of all, he showed no signs of remorse or rehabilitation. If anything, he seemed more calculating, more sophisticated in his manipulation techniques. Danny, who had been released after serving 5 years of his original sentence, was not involved in these new crimes. I learned from Detective Rodriguez that he had actually become an advocate for prison reform and had spoken publicly about the cycle of abuse that had led him to participate in his father's crimes. It was a small comfort to know that at least one of my childhood tormentors had found a path toward redemption. My testimony in the second trial was both easier and harder than it had been in 1964. I was now a 35-year-old woman with education, life experience, and a support system that my 12-year-old self couldn't have imagined. I could articulate the psychological impact of the abuse more clearly, and I wasn't intimidated by the defense attorney's attempts to discredit me. But it was also harder because I now understood, as an adult and a mother, the full magnitude of what had been stolen from me. I could see my own children's innocence and imagine how devastating it would be for that to be destroyed by someone they trusted. The adult perspective made the crimes seem even more heinous than they had when I was experiencing them. The most powerful moment of the trial came when I was asked to address the new victims directly. The prosecutor had arranged for me to speak to them in a private session, away from the media and courtroom drama, to help them understand that they could survive what had happened to them. The 4 boys, ranging in age from 10 to 13, sat in a circle with their parents and therapists, looking like shell-shocked soldiers returning from battle. I recognized the hollow look in their eyes, the way they flinched when adults moved too quickly, the shame that seemed to radiate from their small bodies. "I want you to know," I told them, "that what happened to you was not your fault. The man who hurt you is very good at making children believe they are responsible for adult behavior, but that's a lie. You are victims, not participants, and you deserve to be protected and believed." One of the boys, a 13-year-old named Kevin whose courage in speaking out had led to Uncle Frank's arrest, raised his hand tentatively. "Did you ever get over it?" he asked. "Do the nightmares ever stop?" I smiled at him, this brave child who was asking the question that every survivor wants answered. "The nightmares do get less frequent," I told him honestly. "And when they come, they don't have the same power over you. You learn that you're stronger than your worst experiences, and you discover that helping other people can turn your pain into something meaningful." Another boy, barely 10 years old, whispered, "I thought I was the only one." "You're not alone," I assured him. "You'll never be alone again. There are people who understand what you're going through, people who will help you heal, and people who will make sure you're safe. Most importantly, by being brave enough to tell the truth, you've helped make sure that other children won't be hurt the way you were." The trial lasted 6 weeks, and Uncle Frank was convicted on multiple counts of child sexual abuse. This time, with his history of repeat offenses and the sophistication of his predatory behavior, he was sentenced to 30 years without the possibility of parole. At 64 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. As I watched him being led away in handcuffs, I felt a closure that had eluded me for over 2 decades. The man who had haunted my childhood and adolescence was finally going to be permanently removed from society. The children he had most recently victimized would have justice, and future potential victims would be protected. But more importantly, I had discovered something about myself through the process of testifying again. Speaking out on behalf of those boys had awakened a sense of purpose that I had been unconsciously seeking for years. My volunteer work with abused children suddenly felt insufficient. I wanted to do more, to reach more victims, to create systems that would prevent abuse before it occurred. Within 6 months of Uncle Frank's conviction, I had enrolled in a graduate program in clinical psychology with a specialization in childhood trauma, Marcus. Understanding that this was more than a career change but a calling, supported my decision completely, even though it meant financial sacrifices and years of intensive study while I was already raising 3 children. "You found your mission," he told me one evening as I struggled with textbooks and research papers spread across our dining room table. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for their purpose. You've known yours since you were 12 years old. You just needed time to grow into it." Dr. Kushner, who had remained a mentor and friend throughout the years, was delighted when I told her about my decision to pursue psychology. "You have something that can't be taught in any graduate program," she told me. "You have lived experience of both trauma and recovery. That combination of professional knowledge and personal understanding will make you an extraordinary therapist." The years of graduate study were challenging but fulfilling in ways I had never expected. I learned about the neurobiological impacts of trauma, about resilience and post-traumatic growth, about the latest therapeutic interventions for helping children heal from abuse. But most importantly, I learned that my own journey from victim to survivor to advocate was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern of healing that many trauma survivors experienced when they found ways to transform their pain into purpose. By 1993, I had earned my doctorate and opened a private practice specializing in childhood trauma. My first office was small and modest, but it was designed with everything I had wished for during my own healing journey: soft lighting, comfortable furniture, art supplies for children who couldn't yet put their experiences into words, and, most importantly, an atmosphere of complete safety and acceptance. My first client was a 9-year-old girl named Jessica, whose stepfather had been abusing her for 2 years before she found the courage to tell her mother. As I watched her draw pictures of her family with black scribbles covering the stepfather's face, I saw myself at 11 years old, trying to make sense of a world where the people supposed to protect you could also be the ones who hurt you most. "You're safe now," I told her, the same words Dr. Kushner had spoken to me so many years ago. "And I'm going to help you learn that you're stronger than what happened to you." Working with trauma survivors became more than my profession. It became my passion, and my way of honoring the scared little girl I had once been. Each child I helped heal was a victory against the Uncle Franks of the world. Each family that learned to support a survivor was a step toward a safer society for all children. Word of my work spread quickly through the professional community and among families dealing with trauma. Within 5 years, I had expanded to a group practice with 6 other therapists, and we were providing services to hundreds of families throughout Wisconsin. We offered not just individual therapy, but also support groups, family counseling, and prevention programs in schools and community centers. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I watched children who had been broken by abuse learn to trust again, to play again, to dream about futures that extended beyond their trauma. I saw families learn to communicate about difficult topics and support each other through the healing process. Most importantly, I was living proof to every client I worked with that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, and that even the most devastating experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose. The little girl who had once been too frightened to speak had found her voice and was using it to help others find theirs. Uncle Frank died in prison in 1999, 7 years into his 30-year sentence. I felt no satisfaction at the news, only a quiet relief that he could never hurt another child. His death marked the end of a chapter that had defined much of my life, but by then, I had written new chapters filled with healing, purpose, and hope. Here I am now, 71 years old, sitting in the living room of my farmhouse in Cedar Falls, Wisconsin, looking back on a life that has been marked by both profound darkness and extraordinary light. The house where I live now is just 3 miles from the original farmhouse where my childhood trauma occurred, but it might as well be on a different planet for how different my life has become. Marcus passed away 2 years ago after a brief battle with cancer, and while I miss him every day, I'm grateful for the 46 years we had together. He never once made me feel broken or damaged because of what I had endured as a child. Instead, he saw my survival as evidence of my strength, and he spent our entire marriage supporting my mission to help other trauma survivors find their own paths to healing. Our 3 children have grown into remarkable adults who carry forward the values we instilled in them about protecting the vulnerable and speaking truth to power. Michael became a pediatric nurse and works in the Children's Hospital in Madison, where he specializes in caring for young patients who have experienced abuse. Sarah followed in my footsteps and is now a licensed clinical social worker running her own practice in Milwaukee. Even little Thomas, now 32 and no longer little, works as a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. All 3 of them have told me that their choice of careers was influenced by growing up with a mother who had transformed her own trauma into a mission of healing. They understood from an early age that terrible things sometimes happen to innocent people. But they also learned that those experiences don't have to define or destroy you if you find the courage to seek help and the determination to heal. Last month, I officially retired from my private practice after 28 years of working with trauma survivors. The group practice I founded has grown into the Wisconsin Center for Childhood Trauma Recovery, with 42 therapists, social workers, and support staff serving families throughout the state. More importantly, we've helped train hundreds of other professionals in trauma-informed care, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond our immediate community. The retirement celebration was held in the same community center where I had given my first public speech about childhood trauma 20 years ago. As I looked out at the crowd of colleagues, former clients, family members, and community supporters, I was struck by how many lives had been touched by the work that grew out of my own childhood pain. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was there, the same Sarah who had found the courage to testify against Uncle Frank in 1988 after reading about my case. She had become a psychiatric social worker herself and now leads a national organization focused on preventing childhood sexual abuse. Her presence reminded me of how survivor voices can inspire other survivors to break their silence and seek justice. Several of my former clients spoke at the celebration, sharing how our work together had helped them reclaim their lives and find their own purposes. Jessica, the 9-year-old who had been my first client and who was now 35 with children of her own, stood up to thank me for showing her that she could survive what had happened to her. "Dr. Thompson didn't just help me heal," she said, her voice steady and confident. "She showed me that my experiences, as painful as they were, could become a source of strength. I've spent the last 10 years working with foster children, and every day I think about how she taught me that being broken doesn't mean being destroyed." But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the evening came when Kevin Williams took the podium. Kevin had been 13 when Uncle Frank abused him in 1987, and his courage in speaking out had led to Uncle Frank's final conviction. Now 48 years old and a successful child psychologist himself, Kevin had become one of the leading advocates for male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. "When I was 13 and drowning in shame and fear," he said, "Dr. Thompson, who was still Mrs. Thompson then, sat with a group of scared boys and told us that we could survive what had happened to us. She said we could turn our pain into purpose. I didn't believe her at the time, but she planted a seed that eventually grew into my life's work. Today, I run support groups for male survivors, and I tell them the same thing she told me. You are stronger than your worst experiences." As I listened to these testimonies, I realized that the ripple effects of speaking out about abuse extend far beyond the immediate justice achieved. When one person finds the courage to break their silence, it gives others permission to do the same. When one survivor transforms their pain into purpose, it creates a model that other survivors can follow. The work I've done over the past 3 decades has reached thousands of children and families directly, but the true impact is immeasurable when you consider how many of those survivors have gone on to help others in their own ways. Some became therapists or social workers, others became teachers who know how to recognize signs of abuse, and still others simply became parents who understand the importance of believing their children and protecting them from harm. I think often about the scared 11-year-old girl I once was, huddled in that barn or trapped in my own kitchen, convinced that she was powerless and alone. If I could go back and tell her what her life would become, she wouldn't have believed it. The idea that her suffering could eventually be transformed into a force for healing and protection would have seemed impossible to a child who couldn't even imagine surviving the next day. But that's the miracle of human resilience. We are capable of not just surviving trauma, but of using it as fuel for creating positive change in the world. The very experiences that nearly destroyed me became the foundation for a career dedicated to helping others heal. The voice that was nearly silenced by shame and fear became a powerful tool for advocacy and education. I've learned that healing is not about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. True healing involves integrating our experiences, both good and bad, into a coherent story about who we are and what we value. My story includes chapters of victimization and trauma, but it also includes chapters of recovery, love, family, purpose, and service to others. The nightmares that once plagued my sleep have long since faded, replaced by dreams about the future. About my grandchildren growing up safe and protected, about the continued expansion of trauma-informed care, about a world where children like I once was don't have to suffer in silence. My 8 grandchildren know pieces of their grandmother's story, age-appropriate versions that help them understand why their family talks openly about difficult topics, and why they're taught from an early age that their bodies belong to them, and that they should always tell a trusted adult if anyone makes them uncomfortable. They also know that their grandmother is someone who helps children who have been hurt, and they're proud of that work, even if they don't fully understand its origins. Last week, my youngest granddaughter, Emma, who is 7 years old, asked me why I decided to help children who were sad and scared. I told her that sometimes when people go through difficult experiences, they can use what they learned to help others who are facing similar challenges. Like how you help me when I'm scared of thunderstorms because you know what it's like to be afraid, she asked with the innocent wisdom that children sometimes possess. Exactly like that, I told her, marveling at how simply a child could understand something that had taken me decades to fully comprehend. As I prepare to enter this new phase of my life, grandmother, widow, retired professional, I'm filled with gratitude rather than regret. Yes, I experienced terrible trauma as a child, and yes, it took years of hard work to heal from those experiences. But I also lived to see justice served, to build a loving family, to create meaningful work, and to help thousands of other survivors find their own paths to healing. The 11-year-old girl who was brutalized by her uncle and cousin grew up to become a woman who dedicated her life to making sure other children didn't have to suffer in silence. The voice that was nearly silenced by shame and threats became a powerful force for advocacy and change. The broken child became a healer, the victim became a protector, and the trauma became a teacher. Uncle Frank and Danny thought they could destroy me, that they could steal my voice and my power permanently. They were wrong. Not only did I survive their abuse, but I used the strength I gained from surviving it to help others do the same. In the end, their attempt to destroy me became the very thing that gave my life its greatest meaning and purpose. That's the message I want to leave with anyone who might be listening to my story. You are stronger than your worst experiences. Your voice matters, your survival matters. And if you're willing to do the work of healing, you can transform even your deepest pain into a source of strength and service. The monsters of my childhood are long gone, but their legacy lives on, not in the form of ongoing trauma, but in the form of all the children who have been helped, all the families who have been healed, and all the survivors who have found their voices because one scared little girl eventually found the courage to speak her truth. And that, I believe, is the most powerful victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.